The first snow fell on Emma's 16th birthday, each flake landing like a whispered promise of death. She pressed her palm against the swell beneath her worn calico dress and felt the baby kick once, fierce and demanding, as if it knew what winter meant in the Colorado Territory of 1847. Behind her, the cabin door hung crooked on its hinges, and inside lay the fever-ravaged body of the only person who'd ever called her daughter. Margaret Thompson had died 3 days ago, leaving Emma with nothing but a dwindling pile of cornmeal, a rusty axe, and the terrible mathematics of survival. 1 girl, 1 baby coming, and 5 months until spring. The wind carried the scent of pine and something sharper, the metallic bite that came before the deep cold, the kind that turned breath to crystal and split trees down to their heartwood. Emma had heard the stories from the trading post, whispered between mountain men with frost-bitten fingers and eyes hollow from witnessing too much. Winters here didn't just kill the weak. They devoured the unprepared with a hunger that made wolves seem merciful. She touched the bark of the nearest pine, its surface rough and bitter under her fingertips, and made a decision that would echo through the mountains like a stone dropped into still water. She would live. She would make this baby live. And if that meant eating the forest itself, bark by bitter bark, then so be it. What Emma couldn't know, as she stood there with snow gathering in her auburn hair, was that her choice had already been seen. High on the eastern ridge, where the aspens grew silver and thin, Apache eyes watched through the storm. They had been watching for weeks, these women of the mountain clans, and they recognized something in the girl's stillness that spoke of steel wrapped in vulnerability. They saw a sister, even if she didn't know it yet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Thompson had been alone before Margaret died, but solitude and abandonment were different faces entirely. Solitude was choosing to sit by the creek at dusk, watching the water catch the last light while Margaret hummed inside the cabin. Abandonment was standing in that same doorway 3 days later, staring at the fresh-turned earth where she'd buried the only mother she'd ever known, and understanding that the silence would never again be broken by someone who loved her. Cabin squatted against the mountainside like a wounded animal, its log walls chinked with mud and moss that had frozen hard as stone. Margaret had built it herself after Emma's father disappeared into the wilderness, chasing rumors of gold that glittered more in his imagination than in any streamed. That was 4 years ago, when Emma still believed men came back from the places. They promised to return from Dot. Now she walked through the 2 rooms that had contained her entire world, cataloging what remained of a life shared. The cornmeal barrel held maybe 20 pounds, enough for 2 weeks if she ate sparingly. The root cellar had yielded 3 wizened potatoes and a handful of dried beans that rattled like old bones in their jar. Margaret's rifle hung above the mantel, but Emma had found only 5 bullets in the powder horn, and her knowledge of hunting extended no further than watching her stepmother clean the rabbits and birds that other hands had killed. The baby moved again, a rolling sensation that made her breath catch. Margaret had told her it would come with the spring thaw, which meant February, maybe March if she was lucky. Emma pressed both hands to her belly and tried to imagine the mathematics of it, her body growing a child while she shrank around it. Feeding 2 lives on resources meant for one, and that one already stretched thin as spider silk. She found Margaret's journal tucked beneath the corn husk mattress, its leather cover soft with age and handling. The pages revealed a careful record of survival, which roots could be eaten in desperation, how to make pine needle tea to fight off scurvy, the signs that marked edible bark from poisonous. Margaret had been preparing for this winter, Emma realized. She'd been preparing for the possibility that Emma would face it alone. The inner bark of pine, aspen, and cottonwood can sustain life when properly prepared. One entry read in Margaret's careful script: "Scrape away the outer bark to the white wood beneath. The taste is bitter as sin, but it will keep breath in your body when nothing else will. Mix with what fat you can find. Boil it soft. It is not food as civilized people know it, but civilization is a luxury the mountains do not provide. Emma closed the journal and walked to the window, where frost had painted intricate gardens across the glass. Beyond it, the world had transformed into something alien and beautiful. Snow covered the familiar landmarks, the split boulder where she'd played as a child, the grove of aspens that turned gold each autumn until everything looked the same. White and trackless and vast, she thought of the stories Margaret had told her about the Apache, how they moved through these mountains like smoke, appearing and vanishing according to laws Emma didn't understand. Margaret had spoken of them with a mixture of respect and wariness, never quite fear, but always awareness. They know things about surviving that we've forgotten, she'd said once, watching Emma struggle to start a fire in the rain. Things our grandmothers might have known before we decided comfort was more important than capability. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending snow devils spinning across the yard. Emma lit the oil lamp and settled beside the fire with Margaret's journal, reading by flickering light as the temperature dropped and the cabin creaked around her like a ship in heavy seas. She read about the lean months, about the way hunger changed the taste of everything, making even water seem thin and unsatisfying. She read about the winter Margaret had spent alone before Emma came, when she'd lived for 2 months on nothing but pine bark soup and the occasional rabbit. The hardest part, Margaret had written, is not the hunger itself, but the way it makes you question whether you deserve to live. The body wants to surrender before the spirit does. You must decide, again and again, that your life has value, worth preserving. You must choose to be stubborn in the face of a world that seems determined to erase you. Emma touched her belly again, feeling the small life that swam and turned in its private ocean. She thought about Margaret at 16, probably not much older than Emma was now, learning to survive in a place that killed the unprepared without malice or mercy. Margaret had chosen to be stubborn. She'd chosen to live, and because of that choice, Emma existed. Outside, something howled in the distance wolves, maybe, or just the wind finding the right combination of rocks and trees to make its loneliness audible. Emma banked the fire and pulled Margaret's heaviest quilt around her shoulders. Tomorrow she would begin learning to eat the forest. Tomorrow she would start the long, bitter education that would carry her through to spring. But tonight, she allowed herself one last evening of being the girl who had never been truly hungry, who had never understood that survival was not a given, but a daily negotiation with a world that owed her nothing. She fell asleep with her hand on her belly, whispering promises to the child who would be born into a harder world than the one she'd known, but who would be born nonetheless. In her dreams, she heard drums echoing from the high country, rhythmic as a heartbeat, patient as the turning of seasons. She woke once in the deep night, certain the sound had been real, but when she listened, there was only wind and the settling of snow on the roof. She didn't know that the drums were real, that they carried messages between the Apache camps scattered through the mountains, or that one of those messages concerned a pregnant girl alone in a cabin. A girl whose stubborn refusal to die had already earned her a place in conversations she would never hear. The snow continued to fall, erasing her footprints from the day before, covering the world in a blank page that would either write her death or her transformation. Emma pulled the quilt closer and settled back into sleep while 30 miles away, in a hidden canyon where hot springs kept the snow from settling, Apache women began to plan for spring in ways that would change everything Emma thought she knew about the meaning of sisterhood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The taste of pine bark was like chewing leather soaked in turpentine. Emma gagged on the first bite, her stomach revolting against the bitter pulp that felt more like punishment than nourishment. She'd followed Margaret's instructions exactly, scraping away the rough outer bark until she reached the pale inner layer, boiling it until it softened into something that could charitably be called edible. But knowing something would keep you alive and actually forcing it down your throat were entirely different challenges. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's death, and the cornmeal was gone. The last handful had disappeared 2 days ago, mixed with melted snow into a thin gruel that tasted like desperation. Now Emma sat at the rough wooden table, methodically, chewing bark soup while the baby pressed against her ribs, demanding nutrients she no longer had to give. The hunger had come gradually at first, like a guest who overstayed their welcome. It began as a hollow sensation, easily ignored when Emma kept busy splitting kindling or mending clothes. But hunger was patient. It grew stronger each day, until it became a constant companion that colored every thought and made every movement feel deliberate and precious. Now it sat beside her like a jealous lover, whispering that each calorie belonged to the baby or to her, but never both. Outside, the world had crystallized into something beautiful and merciless. Snow reached halfway up the cabin walls, and the cold had locked the creek solid enough to walk on. Emma had tried setting snares where Margaret had shown her, but the rabbits seemed to have vanished into whatever secret places rabbits went when winter showed its teeth. The few birds that remained were too clever for her clumsy attempts at trapping, leaving behind only tracks in the snow like mocking signatures. She forced down another spoonful of bark soup and tried to remember what being full felt like. The sensation seemed as distant as summer, something that had happened to a different girl in a different life. This new Emma counted calories like a miser counted coins, measuring her life in pine needles and the occasional windfall of dried berries. She found beneath the snow. The baby had grown noticeably larger, making her movements awkward and her sleep fitful. Sometimes she caught herself talking to it, explaining their situation in whispers by the fire. "We're learning to be tough," she would say, rubbing circles on her belly. "Your grandmother Margaret was tough. She survived worse than this." But late at night, when the wind howled like something dying and the cold crept through every crack in the cabin walls, Emma wondered if toughness was enough. It was during one of these restless nights that she first saw the smoke. She'd gotten up to tend the fire, moving carefully in the darkness, when she glimpsed something through the frost-covered window that made her heart stutter. There, across the valley on the eastern slope, a thin column of smoke rose straight up in the still air. It was too far to see clearly, but smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. Emma pressed her face to the glass, her breath fogging the view as she strained to see more. The smoke appeared and disappeared as clouds drifted across the moon. But it was definitely there. Someone else was alive in this frozen wilderness. For a moment, hope flared in her chest like kindling catching flame. Then reality settled back in like cold water. Even if she could reach whoever was making that fire, they might not welcome a starving pregnant girl. Mountain folks were often as suspicious as they were isolated, and resources were too precious to share with strangers. But she watched that smoke every night after that, finding comfort in the knowledge that she wasn't entirely alone. Sometimes she imagined who might be tending that distant fire. Perhaps a trapper wintering in a hidden cabin, or a family like hers, stubborn enough to carve out a life and country that barely tolerated human presence. She never imagined that. The smoke came from a circle of Apache women who had been watching her just as carefully as she watched them. The Apache camp lay concealed in a natural bowl of rock and earth, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The women had chosen this place precisely because it offered what they needed most: invisibility and the thermal springs that kept them warm through the harshest months. Unlike the scattered bands of Apache who followed the old patterns of seasonal movement, this group had learned to adapt, to find spaces between the expanding white settlements where they could maintain their ways without constant conflict. They called themselves the Sisterhood of the Changing Season, and they were led by a woman named Sarah Crowfeather, though she had been born Sarah Mitchell in a cabin much like Emma's, taken by Apache raiders when she was 7 and raised as one of their own. Sarah understood both worlds, spoke both languages, and had spent 30 years learning to navigate the increasingly narrow spaces where her adopted people could live free. She had been the first to spot Emma through her field glass, watching the girl struggle with her snares and shake her head in frustration when the traps came up empty. Sarah had seen the way Emma moved, careful now, protective of her growing belly, but still determined. There was something in that determination that reminded Sarah of her own journey from captive child to respected leader, the way survival could forge strength from the most unlikely materials. "She's trying to make it alone," Sarah told the council of grandmothers who helped guide the group's decisions. They sat in the warm cave system that served as their winter home, walls decorated with painted stories that spanned generations. "The girl knows some of the old ways. I've seen her gathering pine needles, stripping bark. Someone taught her the basics." Elena Deer Runner, the eldest of the council, nodded slowly. Elena had lived through 8 decades of change, had seen the Apache world contract and adapt like a wounded animal, learning new ways to hunt. "The question," she said, "is whether she has the strength to see it through. The baby will come with the spring, yes? She need help then, if not before." "We could leave food," suggested Maria Skywalker, a younger woman whose own children had grown and scattered to other bands. "Small gifts where she might find them. Nothing that would frighten her or make her suspicious." Sarah considered this. The white settlers were unpredictable in their responses to Apache kindness. Some understood it as the gift it was meant to be. Others saw conspiracy and threat in every gesture. But watching Emma these past weeks, Sarah had seen something that convinced her the girl might be different. Emma moved through the forest with a respect that spoke of understanding, never taking more than she needed, always looking around her with the awareness of someone who knew she was a guest in a larger community. "She talks to the trees," observed Rosa Wynn Song, the group's medicine woman. "I've watched her touch them before she cuts bark, the way we do. Someone taught her that the forest has feelings." It was decided that they would begin slowly. A few dried apples left near her woodpile. Some winter berries placed where she set her snares. Small kindnesses that could be explained away as coincidence if the girl proved to be like the others, who saw Apache aid as a prelude to attack. But Emma surprised them when she found the first gift, a small pouch of pemmican tied to a tree branch near her path to the creek. She didn't run back to the cabin for her rifle. Instead, she stood very still for a long moment, looking around the forest with new awareness. Then she reached into her own nearly empty pockets and left behind 3 of her precious pine nuts, placing them carefully beside the tree as an offering. In return, Sarah watched this exchange through her field glass and felt something shift in her chest. The girl understood. She recognized gift-giving as a conversation, not a transaction. This was someone who could be approached, eventually, when the time was right and the need was great enough. That night, Emma sat by her fire with the pemmican in her lap, turning the small bundle over in her hands. The leather pouch was decorated with beadwork and patterns she didn't recognize, and the food inside was unlike anything Margaret had ever made, dense, rich, tasting of berries and meat, and something else she couldn't identify. It was more nourishment than she'd had in days, enough to make her stomach settle into contentment for the first time in weeks. She knew where it had come from, even if she couldn't prove it. Apache. The word carried weight in her mind, shaped by stories and rumors, and the warnings of traveling traders. But sitting there with the gift warming her hands, she couldn't find any fear in herself. Someone was watching her, yes, but watching like a guardian rather than a predator. Someone had seen her struggling and chosen to help, for the first time since Margaret's death. Emma smiled. She touched her belly and whispered to the baby, "We're not as alone as we thought we were." Outside, the wind continued to blow snow against the windows, But the cold seemed less absolute now, the winter less infinite. Spring would come, and with it, changes she couldn't yet imagine. In the Apache camp, the women prepared for sleep around their warm fires, but their dreams were full of preparation. They were getting ready for something larger than leaving food for a starving girl. They were preparing to expand their circle, to offer the kind of sisterhood that could transform a desperate survivor into something stronger, woman who could pass on not just life, but wisdom about how to live it. December carved its signature into the landscape with temperatures so brutal that Emma's breath turned to ice crystals before it reached the ground. The cold had personality now, vindictive, personal, creeping through the cabin's walls like a living thing that despised her audacity for still being alive. She woke each morning to find frost coating the inside of her windows, and sometimes ice had formed in the water bucket beside her bed despite the banked coals in the fireplace. The gifts had become regular, appearing every few days like small miracles that kept her tethered to hope. A handful of dried meat appeared by the creek where she broke ice for water. Pine nuts materialized in a hollow stump near her woodpile. Once, she found a small bundle of medicinal herbs she recognized from Margaret's collection, winter sage that could ease nausea and strengthen the blood. Each gift was placed with careful deliberation, never near enough to the cabin to feel threatening, always in spots where Emma would naturally walk in the course of her daily survival. She had begun leaving her own offerings in return carvings, whittled from pine scraps, small braided grass dolls she made by the fire, drawings scratched onto pieces of birch bark. The gifts were always taken, which confirmed what Emma had suspected from the beginning. Someone was watching, caring, engaging in a conversation that transcended the need for words or even sight. The baby was growing stronger now, its movements more insistent and frequent. Sometimes Emma would wake to tiny feet drumming against her ribs like an impatient prisoner demanding release. She found herself talking to it more often, describing their mysterious benefactors and speculating about their intentions. "They know something about taking care of people," she would murmur, pressing her hands to her belly. "Maybe they know something about taking care of babies too." It was during one of these one-sided conversations that Emma first heard the singing. She had been gathering deadfall for the fire, moving slowly through the snow-heavy forest, when the sound drifted to her on the wind. At first she thought it might be the whistle of air through the canyon walls, but as she stopped to listen, the melody became unmistakable. Women's voices, multiple harmonies weaving together in patterns that seemed to mirror the rhythm of her own heartbeat. The singing was distant, coming from the direction of the smoke she watched each night, but it carried with a clarity that made her skin prickle with recognition. Emma had never heard Apache music before, but something in those voices spoke a language older than words. The melody rose and fell like water over stones, carrying notes of sorrow and strength intertwined until they became indistinguishable. She found herself swaying slightly, her body responding to rhythms she didn't understand but somehow recognized, as if the music awakened memories that weren't quite her own. When the singing stopped, the silence felt different, fuller somehow, as though the forest itself had been listening and was now processing what it had heard. Emma stood motionless for a long moment, afraid that moving would break whatever spell had allowed her to witness something clearly not meant for her ears. Then the baby kicked, hard enough to make her gasp, and she realized her cheeks were wet with tears she didn't remember shedding. That night she dreamed of women in deerskin dresses moving around a fire, their faces painted with symbols that told stories she couldn't read, but desperately wanted to understand. In the dream, one of the women looked directly at her and smiled, extending a hand toward the fire's warmth. Emma woke with the sensation of reaching back. Her own hand stretched toward the cabin's dying embers. In the Apache camp, the singing had been a council of sorts. The women gathered every few days to share observations, make decisions, and honor the spirits that guided their choices. Tonight the conversation centered on Emma and the approaching reality of her situation. Rosa. Winsong had been studying the girl's movements through careful observation, noting the changes in her gait and the way she held herself. "The baby is dropping," Rosa reported to the circle of women. "She has maybe 6 weeks, 8 at most. The birth will come before the worst of winter breaks." Sarah Crowfeather nodded grimly. She had given birth herself in hard circumstances, knew how quickly things could go wrong even under the best conditions. A girl alone, weakened by months of poor nutrition, facing her first child in an isolated cabin, with no experienced hands to guide her. It was a recipe for tragedy that the Sisterhood could not ignore. "She cannot do this alone," declared Elena. Deer Runner, her weathered hands gesturing emphatically. "Birth is women's work, community work. The spirits grow angry when women are forced to bring children into the world without proper support." "But how do we approach her?" asked Maria Skywalker. "She has shown respect, yes, but that doesn't mean she will welcome us into her sacred time. White women are taught different fears than we are." Sarah considered this carefully. She remembered her own early years among the Apache, how long it had taken to unlearn the stories her birth family had told her about savage ways. Trust was a delicate plant that could be destroyed by moving too quickly or speaking the wrong words. "We continue as we have," she decided, "gifts that show our intentions. But we also begin to prepare her. Leave things she will need for the birth: clean cloth, herbs for pain and bleeding, foods that will give her strength. If she accepts these things, we will know she understands what we are offering." The next morning, Emma found a bundle beside her door that made her heart race with recognition and fear. Wrapped in soft doeskin were strips of clean linen, dried roots she recognized as pain relievers, and a small clay pot filled with what smelled like healing salve. There was also something else, a wooden figurine carved in the shape of a woman, with her arms raised skyward, her belly round with child. Emma lifted the figurine with trembling hands, understanding immediately what message was being conveyed. Her mysterious guardians knew about the baby. They knew about the birth that was coming, and they were offering help. She sank onto the cabin steps, overwhelmed by a mixture of gratitude and terror. The gifts were generous beyond anything she could have hoped for, but they also meant her situation was more precarious than she had wanted to admit. Someone was watching closely enough to know the baby's timing, which meant her isolation was more illusion than reality. The thought should have frightened her, but instead she felt a strange sense of relief. She wasn't alone. Whatever happened in the weeks to come, she wouldn't be facing it entirely alone. That afternoon, Emma made a decision that would have shocked Margaret and terrified most of the settlers at the distant trading post. She walked to the edge of the forest, to the largest pine tree within sight of her cabin, and hung one of Margaret's quilts from its branches like a flag. Then she stood beneath it and spoke aloud, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said, looking toward the ridge where she had seen the smoke. "But I want you to know that I'm grateful. I know you're watching over me, and I know you understand what's coming. If something goes wrong, if I can't." She paused, pressing her hand to her belly. "Please don't let my baby die alone." The words hung in the air like visible things, crystallizing in the cold and drifting upward with her breath. Emma waited, not sure what she was hoping for, then turned and walked back to the cabin with the strange sensation that she had just crossed a bridge she hadn't known was there. High on the eastern ridge, Sarah Crowfeather lowered her field glass and felt her chest tighten with emotion. The girl had hung the quilt as a signal, but more than that, she had spoken to them directly, acknowledging their presence and asking for their help. It was an act of trust so complete and vulnerable that Sarah felt the weight of it like a sacred responsibility. "She knows," Sarah told the council that evening. "She knows we're here, and she's asking for our protection." Elena Deer Runner smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face into something radiant. "Then we will give it to her. The spirits have brought us this opportunity to practice the old ways of sisterhood. We will not waste their gift." The preparations began that night. The women opened bundles they had been saving for special occasions, bringing out birthing blankets and ceremonial herbs, tools and knowledge passed down through generations of Apache mothers. They sang songs of protection and strength, weaving their voices into a net of intention that would hold Emma safe through whatever trials approached. In her cabin, Emma heard the singing again, stronger now and closer. This time she didn't wonder what it meant. She wrapped herself in Margaret's heaviest blanket, placed her hands on her belly, and listened to voices that promised she would not face the darkness alone. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without counting her remaining food supplies or calculating how many more days she could survive. Instead, she dreamed of hands reaching toward her through flames, and voices calling her name in languages she was only beginning to understand. January arrived like a predator that had been circling for weeks, finally ready to strike. The temperature plummeted to depths that made Emma's previous struggles seem like mild discomfort. Ice formed inside the cabin now, coating the walls with a crystalline skin that never fully melted even when she fed the fire constantly. Her water bucket froze solid each night, and she had to break it with Margaret's hammer each morning just to have something to drink. The baby had grown so large that Emma could barely move without discomfort. Simple tasks like splitting kindling or carrying water became monumental efforts that left her breathless and aching. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the child's restless movements and the persistent pain in her lower back that seemed to worsen each day. Sometimes she would wake to find herself talking to Margaret in the darkness, asking questions that would never be answered about what came next. The gifts from her guardians had become more frequent and more specific. Soft rabbit furs appeared for the baby's bedding. A small wooden bowl, perfectly sized for tiny hands, materialized beside the creek. Most precious of all was the food-dried meat, preserved berries, and something new that Emma had never tasted before, a rich, creamy paste made from pine nuts and honey that gave her more energy than anything she had eaten in months. But it was the morning she found the moccasins that Emma truly understood how closely she was being watched. They sat beside her door like patient visitors, perfectly sized for her swollen feet, made from the softest deerskin she had ever touched. The beadwork on them told a story in symbols she couldn't read, but somehow felt in her bone spirals that might have been seasons, diamonds that could have been stars, lines that curved like rivers or paths through mountains. When she slipped them on, they fit as if they had been made specifically for her feet, which Emma realized with a shiver of recognition. They probably had been. Someone had been watching her walk, studying her gait, measuring her needs with the careful attention of a mother preparing for a beloved child. The intimacy of that observation should have frightened her, but instead, it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the moccasin's fleece lining. She was being cared for with a thoroughness that spoke of genuine affection, not mere charity. That afternoon, Emma made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months before. She wrapped herself in Margaret's heaviest coat, pulled the new moccasins onto her feet, and walked into the forest deliberately, not to gather wood or check snares, but to find the people who had been taking care of her. She followed the smoke that rose each evening from the eastern ridge, moving slowly through snow that sometimes reached her knees. The baby protested the exertion, pressing against her ribs until she had to stop frequently to catch her breath. But Emma persisted, driven by a need that was stronger than physical discomfort, the need to see the faces of the women who had become her invisible sisters. The climb up the ridge was treacherous, made more dangerous by her altered balance and the icy conditions. Twice she slipped, catching herself on pine branches that scratched her hands and sent small avalanches cascading down the slope. By the time she reached the top, Her legs were shaking with exhaustion, and the baby was moving frantically, as if protesting the adventure. What Emma saw from the ridge made her forget her discomfort entirely. Below her, nestled in a natural bowl of rock and earth, lay a settlement unlike anything she had ever imagined. Steam rose from what looked like natural hot springs, creating a microclimate where the snow had melted and grass still grew green. Women moved between structures that seemed to blend seamlessly with the landscape, not tipis as she had expected, but buildings made from stone and earth that looked like they had grown from the mountainside itself. But it was the women themselves that captured Emma's attention. There were dozens of them, ranging from girls who looked younger than herself to grandmothers with silver hair braided with beads and feathers. They moved with purposeful grace, tending fires, preparing food, working hides, and caring for children who played in the warm spaces near the springs. This wasn't a temporary camp, it was a community, a place where women had created a world of their own in the harsh mountain wilderness. Emma watched, mesmerized, as the women went about their daily lives. She saw them helping each other with tasks, sharing meals, laughing together in ways that reminded her of her own conversations with Margaret. But there was something else in their interactions, something Emma had never experienced herself, a network of support that seemed to extend naturally to every member of the community. No one worked alone. No one struggled without assistance. No one seemed to face difficulties in isolation. It was then that Emma understood what had been offered to her all these months. Not just food and supplies, but inclusion. Not just survival, but sisterhood. One of the women looked up suddenly, scanning the ridge as if she had sensed Emma's presence. Emma recognized her immediately, though she had never seen her before. This was the woman from her dreams, the one with the painted face and the extended hand. But now, in daylight, Emma could see that she was younger than expected, perhaps in her 30s, with skin that spoke of both European and Apache heritage and eyes that held depths of experience. Emma couldn't fathom that the woman, Sarah Crowfeather, though Emma didn't know her name yet, smiled and raised her hand in greeting. Not a wave, exactly, but a gesture of acknowledgement that carried no surprise, as if she had been expecting Emma to arrive at exactly this moment. Emma raised her own hand in response, and in that simple exchange felt something shift inside her chest. The isolation that had defined her life for so long cracked like ice in spring sun. These women had been waiting for her, preparing for her, creating space for her in their circle, long before she had known such a thing was possible. Baby chose that moment to deliver a kick so powerful that Emma gasped and doubled over, her hands flying to her belly. The contraction that followed was different from the Braxton Hicks she had been experiencing, deeper, more insistent, rolling through her body like a wave that left her breathless and shaking. When she looked up, Sarah Crowfeather was climbing toward her, moving with the sure-footed grace of someone who had navigated these slopes for years. Behind her, Emma could see other women gathering, their faces turned upward with expressions of concern and readiness. "English?" Sarah called out as she approached, her voice carrying a slight accent that Emma couldn't place. "Yes," Emma managed, still catching her breath from the contraction. "I'm Emma Thompson." Sarah smiled again, and Emma saw kindness in her expression that made her eyes fill with tears. "I am Sarah Crowfeather. We have been waiting for you." "Waiting for me?" "The baby is coming soon," Sarah said, reaching Emma's side and offering her arm for support. "Tonight, maybe tomorrow. You should not be alone for this." Emma felt another contraction building, this one stronger than the last. She gripped Sarah's arm and let herself be guided down the treacherous slope toward the warm springs below. With each step, the isolation that had defined her winter began to fall away like shed skin. She was walking into a world where women supported each other through life's most challenging moments, where knowledge was shared freely, where no one faced the darkness alone. "My stepmother," Emma gasped between contractions. She's buried near my cabin. I can't just leave her. Sarah's expression softened. The dead do not hold us to the earth, she said gently. They give us wings to fly toward life. Your stepmother would want you to live, to let your child live. She would want you to accept help when it is offered. As they reached the settlement, Emma felt herself surrounded by women who reached out to steady her, to offer comfort, to welcome her into their circle. The warmth from the springs enveloped her like an embrace, and for the first time in months, she felt truly warm. We have prepared a place for you, Sarah said, guiding her toward a structure that seemed to glow from within. Everything you need is ready. You are safe now. Emma looked around at the faces surrounding her, women of different ages, different backgrounds, but all united by a common purpose. They had been watching her, protecting her, preparing for this moment when she would need them most. The sisterhood she had never known existed had opened its arms to include her, and as another contraction gripped her body, Emma understood that she was about to give birth not just to a child, but to a new version of herself. The winter that had threatened to destroy her was instead becoming the crucible that would forge her into something stronger. Surrounded by women who understood that survival was not a solitary endeavor, but a communal art passed down through generations of mothers who had faced the darkness and emerged, carrying light, the birthing lodge sat at the heart of the settlement, like a sacred heart beating with ancient rhythms. Emma had never seen anything like it. Walls made from river stones fitted together without mortar, a roof of woven branches sealed with clay and moss, and inside, a warmth that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Steam from the nearby hot springs drifted through carefully placed vents, creating an atmosphere that felt both protective and otherworldly. Rosa Windsong, the medicine woman, moved around Emma with the practiced efficiency of someone who had guided countless women through this passage. Her hands were gentle but sure as she examined Emma's progress, her eyes holding depths of knowledge that stretched back through generations of Apache midwives. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had never lost a mother or child to the uncertainties of birth. Your body knows what to do, Rosa told Emma, pressing a cup of warm tea into her hands. The liquid tasted of mint and something else, something that seemed to ease the intensity of the contractions without dulling Emma's awareness. Apache women have been birthing babies in this place for 3 generations. The spirits here are strong, protective. They will help you. Emma sipped the tea and looked around the lodge, marveling at the preparations that had been made for her arrival. Soft furs covered the floor in layers, creating a nest-like space where she could move freely as her body demanded. Baskets filled with clean cloths sat ready, along with bowls of water that steamed gently in the warm air. The walls were decorated with symbols she was beginning to recognize: spirals for the cycles of life, mountain shapes for strength, water patterns for flow and change. But it was the women themselves who created the true magic of the space. They came and went like a choreographed dance, each one bringing something essential to Emma's comfort and safety. Maria Skywalker appeared with warm broth that tasted like nothing Emma had ever experienced, rich with herbs and meat, but carrying flavors that seemed to tell stories of the land itself. Elena Deer Runner sat in the corner, her weathered hands working steadily on something Emma couldn't see, her presence radiating the kind of calm that came from having witnessed the full spectrum of human experience. "Tell me about your stepmother," Sarah Crowfeather said, settling beside Emma as another contraction built and peaked. What kind of woman was she? Emma found that talking helped distract her from the intensity of the labor. "Strong," she said, breathing through the wave of pain. Stronger than she looked. She could do anything: hunt, build, heal. She taught me that survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about staying human while you did it. Sarah nodded, understanding. She sounds like a Apache woman. We believe that strength passes from mother to daughter, even when the blood is not shared. Your stepmother gave you her strength. Now you will give strength to your child." The labor progressed through the afternoon and into evening, following rhythms that seemed as old as the mountains themselves. Emma walked when her body wanted movement, supported by women who anticipated her needs before she knew them herself. She rested when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, cushioned by furs and surrounded by voices that sang soft lullabies in languages that made her feel somehow homesick for places she had never been. As the sun set and the lodge filled with the warm glow of oil lamps, Emma began to understand something profound about the nature of sisterhood. These women barely knew her, had no obligation to her beyond shared humanity, yet they tended to her with the devotion of blood relatives. They had created space for her, not because she had earned it or paid for it, but simply because she was a woman about to become a mother, and that made her automatically part of their circle. In our tradition, Elena Deer Runner explained during one of Emma's rest periods, birth belongs to all women, not just the mother. Every child born strengthens the entire community. Every mother who survives makes all mothers stronger. The grandmother's words proved prophetic as the night deepened and Emma's labor intensified. Other women began arriving at the lodge, some she had seen earlier in the settlement, others who seemed to emerge from the forest itself. They came bearing gifts, soft blankets woven from rabbit fur, tiny moccasins that would fit newborn feet, carved toys that would soothe a crying infant. But more than material gifts, they brought their presence, their energy, their accumulated wisdom about the mysteries of bringing life into the world. Emma found herself supported by a network she had never imagined possible. When pain threatened to overwhelm her, strong hands massaged her back and shoulders. When fear crept into her thoughts, gentle voices reminded her of her own power and capability. When exhaustion made her want to give up, women who had walked this path before her shared stories of their own births, their own moments of doubt and triumph. "My first baby took 2 days," Maria Skywalker whispered during one particularly difficult contraction. "I thought I would die, that the baby would die. But my grandmother told me, pain is just the price we pay for the privilege of creating life. After that, I could bear anything." As midnight approached, Rosa Windsong announced that the baby was ready to be born. Emma felt a fundamental shift in her body, a bearing down sensation that was different from anything she had experienced before. The women around her formed a closer circle, their voices joining in a low, rhythmic chant that seemed to harmonize with the contractions themselves. "Now you work with your body, not against it," Rosa instructed, her hands steady and sure as she guided Emma into the optimal position. "Feel how the baby wants to come. Trust what your body tells you." Emma had never felt more powerful or more vulnerable than in those final moments of labor. The pain was intense beyond anything she could have imagined, but it was purposeful pain. Pain with meaning, pain that was creating rather than destroying. She found herself drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Strength that seemed to flow not just from her own body, but from all the women surrounding her. From Margaret's memory, from the land itself. When the baby finally emerged into the waiting hands of the midwife, the sound it made was not the thin cry Emma had expected, but a robust wail that seemed to announce its intention to claim a place in the world. Rosa lifted the child, a daughter. Emma saw through tears of exhaustion and joy and placed her immediately on Emma's chest, where she settled into quiet alertness, dark eyes seeming to take in everything around her with ancient wisdom. "She is perfect," Rosa declared, and the other women murmured agreement. "Strong lungs, good color, all her parts in the right places. This is a child who will survive and thrive." Emma looked down at her daughter and felt something fundamental shift. Inside her chest, this tiny person had been her companion through the long winter months, had shared her struggles and her fears, had somehow given her the strength to survive when survival seemed impossible. Now she was here, real and breathing and dependent on Emma in ways that were both terrifying and miraculous. "What will you call her?" Sarah asked, settling beside them with a soft blanket to wrap around the baby. Emma had thought about names during the long nights in the cabin, but none of the possibilities she had considered seemed adequate now. Looking at her daughter's face, seeing the strength already evident in her steady gaze, Emma found herself thinking of the women who had saved them both, the sisterhood that had appeared when she needed it most. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope." The women around her smiled, and Elena Deer Runner nodded approvingly. A good name, a name that honors what brought her into the world. As dawn broke over the settlement, Emma sat surrounded by her new sisters, holding her daughter close and marveling at the transformation that had taken place. She had entered the winter as a frightened girl facing an impossible situation alone. She was emerging as a mother, supported by a community that had claimed her as their own. But even as she basked in the warmth of acceptance and the joy of successful birth, Emma sensed that her story was not ending but beginning. The women around her carried themselves with the confidence of people who had found their place in the world, who had learned to create safety and abundance even in the harshest circumstances. They had something to teach her that went far beyond survival. They had knowledge about how to build a life worth living. Outside the lodge, the settlement was waking to a new day. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children's voices carried on the morning air, and the eternal springs sent their healing vapors into the clear mountain sky. Emma looked out through the lodge's entrance and saw not just a refuge from the winter, but a doorway into a future she was only beginning to imagine. Hope stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that would soon become Emma's most familiar music. As she looked down at her daughter, Emma understood that she was not just holding a baby. She was holding the next link in a chain of women who refused to be broken by circumstance, who transformed challenges into strength, who created families. From the raw materials of human kindness, the winter that had threatened to destroy them had instead forged them into something new and unbreakable. And as the sun climbed higher, promising the eventual return of spring, Emma knew that whatever came next, she would face it not alone, but surrounded by sisters who understood that survival was just the beginning of what women could accomplish. When they stood together, the first weeks of Hope's life unfolded like a masterclass in motherhood that Emma never could have imagined receiving. In the settlement, caring for a newborn was not a solitary struggle, but a community endeavor where knowledge flowed freely between generations. Emma found herself surrounded by women who treated her inexperience not as a failing but as an opportunity to share wisdom that had been accumulating for centuries. Elena Deer Runner became Emma's most patient teacher, showing her how to read Hope's different cries, how to position the baby for optimal feeding, how to recognize the signs of illness versus normal newborn fussiness. The grandmother's hands, weathered by 8 decades of life, moved with surprising gentleness as she demonstrated swaddling techniques that seemed to transform Hope from a squirming bundle of needs into a peaceful, secure infant. "Babies are like wild horses," Elena explained one morning as she watched Emma struggle with a particularly fussy period. "They test you to see if you are strong enough to keep them safe. Once they trust your strength, they settle." The wisdom proved accurate. As Emma grew more confident in her movements, more certain of her responses to Hope's needs, the baby seemed to relax into the rhythm of their new life together. The crying fits that had initially left Emma feeling helpless gradually gave way to longer periods of contentment, and Hope began to show the first signs of recognition when Emma spoke to her, but it was the practical skills that truly transformed Emma's understanding of what it meant to be a mother in this place. Maria Skywalker taught her how to make soft foods from pine nuts and berries that would help her body recover from birth while providing rich milk for Hope. Rosa Wind Song showed her medicinal plants that could ease the discomforts of nursing and help her sleep more deeply during the brief windows when Hope was settled. Most importantly, Sarah Crow Feather began teaching Emma the deeper lessons of survival that went beyond mere subsistence. They would sit together in the early mornings, before the settlement fully awakened, while Hope slept peacefully between them, and Sarah would share stories that carried instructions disguised as entertainment. There was once a woman who thought. Strength meant never asking for help, Sarah said one morning, her fingers working steadily on a pair of tiny moccasins for Hope. She lived alone on a mountain, proud of her independence, scorning the weakness she saw in others who relied on community. When winter came, she was prepared, or so she thought. But when her roof collapsed under heavy snow, there was no one to help her repair it. When she injured her hand and could not hunt, there was no one to bring her food. She survived that winter, but she learned that true strength is not about standing alone. It is about building connections strong enough to hold you when you falter. Emma understood that these stories were meant for her, lessons about the choice she now faced. The settlement had welcomed her through her most vulnerable time, but she was strong enough now to leave if she chose. Hope was healthy, Emma was recovering. Well, and spring was beginning to show its face in the longer days, and the occasional bird song that carried on the wind. She could return to Margaret's cabin, could raise hope in the world she had known before the winter changed everything. But the thought of leaving felt like tearing away part of herself. In the weeks since Hope's birth, Emma had discovered what it meant to be part of something larger than her individual struggle. She had experienced the security of shared knowledge, the comfort of communal support, the joy of watching other children grow and thrive in an environment where every adult took responsibility for every child's well-being. The settlement's children ranged in age from infants to teenagers, and Emma was amazed by their confidence and capability. 8-year-old Anna Lightfoot could track animals through the forest with accuracy that would shame most adult hunters. 12-year-old James River Walker spoke 3 languages fluently and could calculate complex trade negotiations in his head. 15-year-old Rebecca Winsong had already mastered the healing arts well enough to assist Rosa with medical emergencies. How do they learn so much so young? Emma asked Sarah one afternoon as they watched the children engaged in what looked like play but was clearly education disguised as games. Because they are never told they are too young to learn, Sarah replied. In white settlements, children are kept separate from adult responsibilities until some arbitrary age. Here, children learn by doing, by being included in real work from the time they can walk. They grow up understanding that they are capable of far more than most people believe possible. Emma began to imagine Hope growing up in such an environment, developing skills and confidence that would make her truly independent rather than merely isolated. She pictured her daughter learning to read the forest's moods, to find food and medicine in what others saw as wilderness, to move through the world with the kind of self-assurance that came from deep knowledge rather than shallow bravado. Even as she fell more deeply in love with the life the settlement offered, Emma knew she could not simply disappear into it without consequences. She was still Emma Thompson, a white woman who had vanished from the known world during a harsh winter. People would eventually come looking traders who remembered Margaret, perhaps officials from the territorial government who kept rough track of isolated homesteads. It was Sarah who finally raised the question that had been lurking beneath all their conversations. "You are thinking about the outside world," she said one evening as they sat by the hot springs, Hope sleeping peacefully in Emma's arms. "About the people who will wonder what happened to you." Emma nodded, grateful that Sarah had brought it into the open. "I can't just disappear. Margaret had friends at the trading post. They'll expect to see me come spring, to check on how we survived the winter. If I don't appear, they might send search parties." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from the water. "What if you appeared, but different than you were before? What do you mean? What if Emma Thompson returned from her winter not as a helpless girl who barely survived, but as a woman who had learned new ways of living? What if she brought skills and knowledge that could help bridge the gap between our world and theirs?" The idea was revolutionary in its simplicity. Emma could return to the outer world, could maintain her connections to the life she had known, but she could do so as an ambassador carrying knowledge and perspectives that might benefit both communities. She could be a bridge between worlds rather than having to choose one or the other completely. The trading post could benefit from what we know about surviving in these mountains, Sarah continued. About finding food when crops fail, about healing with native plants, about building structures that work with the land instead of fighting against it. And we could benefit from access to certain goods and information that only come through trade with the outside world. Emma felt something shift in her understanding of her situation. She had been thinking in terms of either or, but Sarah was proposing a both-and solution that could preserve what she valued from both worlds while creating something new and beneficial for everyone involved. Would the settlement accept that? Emma asked. Having someone who moves between worlds who might bring unwanted attention. Sarah smiled, the expression carrying depths of experience Emma was still learning to read. This settlement exists because we learn to adapt, to find new ways of preserving what matters while changing what doesn't serve us. We are not traditional. Apache in the way my grandmothers were, just as you are not traditional white settler in the way your stepmother was. We are something new, created by necessity and shaped by choice. Over the following days, Emma began to see how such an arrangement might work. She could spend winters in the settlement, where hope would be surrounded by the safety and wisdom of the community. In spring and summer, she could return to Margaret's cabin, maintaining her place in the outside world while practicing the skills she had learned during her time with the Apache women. The plan had practical benefits as well. The cabin would serve as a meeting point where trade could occur discreetly, where members of the settlement could obtain goods they needed without exposing the location of their hidden community. Emma's presence would provide a legitimate explanation for any Apache activity in the area. She was simply receiving help from friendly natives who had aided her through her difficult winter. But beyond the practical considerations, the arrangement offered something more precious, the possibility of giving Hope a childhood that combined the best of both worlds. She could grow up with the skills and confidence of the Apache children, while also understanding how to navigate the white world she would inevitably encounter. She could have the security of community without sacrificing the independence that would serve her well in any circumstances she might face. As March arrived and the snow began its slow retreat from the lower elevations, Emma felt herself preparing for a transformation that would be as profound as any she had already experienced. She was about to become not just a survivor or even a mother, but a pioneer in a new way of living that honored the wisdom of different cultures while creating space for something entirely original. Hope seemed to sense the approaching change, becoming more alert and responsive, as if she understood that her quiet world of warm springs and gentle voices was about to expand into something larger and more complex. Emma would hold her daughter close in the evenings, whispering about the adventures that awaited them, the people they would meet, the bridges they would help build between worlds that had too long viewed each other with suspicion and fear. Winter that had begun with the threat of death was ending with the promise of unprecedented life, not just biological life, but a way of living that could serve as a model for how different peoples might learn from each other instead of simply competing for the same resources. Emma was about to discover that survival was indeed just the beginning of what women could accomplish when they refused to be limited by the expectations of any single world. The cabin stood exactly as Emma had left it 3 months earlier, but everything else had changed. Snow still clung to the shaded corners of the roof, and frost still painted delicate patterns on the windows each morning. But the desperate cold that had nearly killed her was giving way to something gentler. The wind no longer carried the sharp bite of mortal threat, and the sun lingered a little longer each day, promising that winter's grip was finally loosening. Emma stood in the doorway, Hope sleeping peacefully in a cradle board that Maria Skywalker had crafted specifically for this journey. The baby carrier was a work of art, soft deerskin decorated with beadwork that told the story of Hope's birth. Practical straps that distributed weight evenly across Emma's shoulders, and a design that kept the baby secure while allowing Emma full use of her hands. It represented everything Emma had learned about the difference between mere survival and thriving with purpose. The cabin felt smaller than she remembered, and achingly empty. Margaret's presence seemed to linger in every corner, her coffee cup still sitting beside the cold stove, her sewing basket with a half-finished quilt folded neatly inside, her rifle hanging above the mantel where Emma had left it months ago. But the emptiness no longer felt like abandonment. Instead, it felt like space waiting to be filled with new purpose. Emma had not come alone. Sarah Crowfeather and Rosa Windsong had accompanied her, ostensibly to help her re-establish herself in the cabin, but really to assess how the bridge between worlds might actually function. They moved through the small space with the respectful curiosity of people entering a sacred site, understanding that they were seeing the place where Emma's transformation had begun. "Your stepmother chose this location well," Sarah observed, examining the cabin's position relative to water, wind patterns, and natural shelter. She understood how to read the land's intentions. Emma felt a surge of pride at the compliment. Margaret had indeed possessed an almost supernatural ability to work with the environment rather than against it, and Emma was beginning to understand how much of that wisdom had been absorbed through years of observation and imitation. The work of reopening the cabin required skills Emma hadn't possessed before her winter with the Apache women. She now knew how to check for structural damage caused by ice and snow, how to clear debris from the chimney safely, how to test stored food for spoilage without risking illness. Most importantly, she knew how to prioritize tasks in order of survival necessity rather than comfort preference. But it was Hope's presence that truly transformed the space. The baby's soft sounds and movements filled the silence that had once pressed against Emma like a living thing. When Hope fussed, Emma found herself automatically humming the Apache lullabies she had learned. And when the baby slept, Emma could work without the constant undercurrent of fear that had characterized her previous time alone. Rosa Windsong had brought supplies that would help Emma establish her new role as cultural intermediary. Bundles of medicinal herbs grew in the settlement's sheltered gardens, dried foods that would supplement whatever Emma could hunt or gather, and trade goods that could be gradually introduced to the outside world without raising suspicion about their origin. "Start slowly," Rosa advised as they organized the supplies in Margaret's old root cellar. "Bring 1 or 2 remedies to the trading post when someone has need. Let them see the effectiveness before you explain the source. People are more willing to accept help when they are desperate than when they are merely curious." The wisdom of this approach became clear when Emma made her first venture to Henderson's trading post, 6 miles down the mountain trail. She had waited until Hope was 8 weeks old and strong enough for the journey, then packed carefully for what she knew would be a momentous reunion with the world she had left behind. Jacob Henderson was a weathered man in his 50s who had known Margaret since she first arrived in the territory. His trading post served as the unofficial center of communication for the scattered homesteaders and travelers who passed through the mountain region. When Emma appeared in his doorway, carrying Hope in the beautiful cradle board, his face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. "Emma Thompson," he breathed, setting down the account book he had been reviewing. "We thought when Margaret didn't come for supplies in the fall, and then the winter was so harsh." He trailed off, clearly struggling to process her appearance. "We sent Charlie Morrison up to check on you folks after the first thaw, but there was no smoke from your chimney, no signs of life." "I survived," Emma said simply, allowing him to draw his own conclusions about the months between then and now. "Margaret died of fever in November. I've been managing on my own." Henderson's eyes moved from Emma's face to Hope, then to the cradle board with its obviously native construction. Emma could see him processing the implications, trying to reconcile the story of a girl surviving alone with the evidence that she had clearly received help from sources he wouldn't have expected. That's remarkable," he said finally. "And the baby?" "Born in February," Emma replied, stroking Hope's soft hair. "She's strong, healthy. We've been learning to live in these mountains." It was then that Mrs. Henderson emerged from the back room, drawn by the sound of voices. Catherine Henderson was a practical woman who had raised 5 children of her own in frontier conditions, and her maternal instincts activated immediately upon seeing Hope. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed, approaching with the confident manner of someone accustomed to handling babies. "May I? She's beautiful, Emma, absolutely beautiful." As Mrs. Henderson cooed over Hope, her husband's attention fixed on the cradle board with the intensity of someone who traded regularly with various native groups and recognized superior craftsmanship when he saw it. "That's beautiful work," he said carefully. "Where did you ... "I had help during the winter," Emma said, meeting his gaze steadily. "When I was struggling, some Apache women found me. They probably saved our lives." The admission hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through assumptions and expectations. Emma watched Henderson process this information, saw him mentally revising his understanding of her survival story. "Apache women," he repeated slowly. "They helped you through your confinement?" "They did more than that," Emma said, allowing some of the gratitude she felt to color her voice. "They taught me things about living in these mountains that I never could have learned alone. About plants that can heal, about reading weather patterns, about finding food when hunting fails." Mrs. Henderson looked up from Hope with renewed interest. "What kind of plants?" This was the opening Rosa had prepared Emma for. From her pack, Emma withdrew a small bundle of dried willow bark and a pouch of pine needle tea. "This is for pain and fever," she said, holding up the willow bark. "Much more effective than laudanum, and without the dangerous side effects. And this," she indicated the pine needles, "prevents scurvy and helps with chest ailments." Mrs. Henderson accepted the samples with the eager attention of someone who had dealt with inadequate medical supplies throughout her frontier life. "The Apache women taught you this?" "They have knowledge passed down through generations," Emma explained. "Ways of healing that work with the body instead of fighting against it. They were incredibly generous with their wisdom." Over the next hour, Emma found herself telling a carefully edited version of her winter experience. She described the desperation of eating bark to survive, the gradual appearance of helpful gifts, the eventual contact with women who understood childbirth and infant care in ways that had saved both Emma and Hope. She spoke of learning skills that had transformed her from a struggling victim of circumstances into someone capable of thriving in conditions that would defeat most people. The Hendersons listened with growing amazement and respect. Emma could see them revising their mental image of her from poor orphaned girl who barely survived to remarkable young woman who had built bridges with previously unknown allies. "Would these women," Henderson asked carefully, "be open to trade relationships? We have goods they might find useful, and clearly they have knowledge and skills that could benefit our community." Emma felt a thrill of success. This was exactly the conversation Sarah had hoped would develop naturally from Emma's reappearance in the white world. "I think they might be interested in careful, respectful exchange," she said. "They're not looking for charity or conquest, just mutual benefit. They value things like metal tools, certain fabrics, sugar, and coffee when available. In return, they can offer medicines, crafted goods, and knowledge about surviving in these mountains." The seed was planted. Over the following weeks, Emma made regular trips to the trading post, each time bringing small samples of Apache medicines and crafts, building trust and demonstrating value. Word spread among the scattered homesteaders about the remarkable young mother who had not only survived an impossible winter, but had emerged with new knowledge and allies. Some reactions were predictably negative. A few of the more rigid settlers viewed any association with native people as dangerous and potentially treasonous. But these voices were outnumbered by practical people who recognized the value of knowledge that could keep them alive in harsh conditions. Emma found herself becoming something she had never expected to be, a respected figure in the community, someone people sought out for advice about mountain survival, someone whose opinions carried weight in discussions about how to build sustainable lives in challenging terrain. But her most important role remained her function as bridge between worlds. Each evening, she would return to the cabin and record the day's conversations in a journal she had started keeping, noting which people seemed most open to cultural exchange, what kinds of goods were most in demand, what health problems were most common in the white community. This information would be invaluable when the time came for more formal contact between the Apache settlement and the outside world. Emma was laying the groundwork for relationships that could benefit everyone involved, creating possibilities for cooperation instead of conflict. Hope thrived in this new routine, adapting easily to the movement between cabin and trading post, charming everyone she met with her bright eyes and ready smiles. Emma could see that her daughter was going to grow up comfortable in multiple worlds, able to navigate different cultures with the confidence that came from early exposure to diversity. As spring advanced and the last snow melted from the higher elevations, Emma began to prepare for the next phase of her unique life. Soon, the Apache women would begin their spring travels, and Emma would have the opportunity to introduce selected members of the white community to her sisters from the hidden settlement. The winter that had begun with the threat of death was transforming into something unprecedented, a genuine partnership between peoples who had previously known each other only through fear and stereotype. Emma stood at the center of this transformation, no longer just a survivor but a creator of new possibilities for how different worlds might learn to support and strengthen each other. May brought the first truly warm day Emma had experienced in nearly a year, with sunshine that felt like a blessing against her skin and air that carried the green scent of new growth. She stood in the meadow behind Margaret's cabin, watching Hope try to grasp at dandelion fluff that danced just beyond her reach, when she saw the signal that would change everything. Smoke rose from 3 different points on the eastern ridge, the single column she had grown accustomed to seeing, but a deliberate pattern that Sarah had taught her to recognize. The spring gathering was about to begin, and Emma was being invited to witness something that few white people had ever seen: the convergence of multiple Apache bands for the season's most important ceremonies and councils. Emma had been preparing for this moment since her return to the cabin. Over the past month, she had carefully cultivated relationships with selected members of the white community, identifying those who might be open to unprecedented cultural exchange. Dr. William Hayes, the circuit physician who visited the area monthly, had shown particular interest in Apache healing methods after Emma had successfully treated a case of infected wounds that had resisted his conventional treatments. Margaret Sullivan, a widow who ran a small farm with her 2 teenage sons, had eagerly learned Apache techniques for preserving food and preparing nutrition-rich meals from wild plants. Most importantly, Emma had gradually won over Sheriff Tom Bradley, a pragmatic man who understood that cooperation with native peoples was more effective than conflict for maintaining peace in the remote mountain region. Bradley had initially approached Emma with suspicion, but her obvious competence and the clear benefits of her knowledge had convinced him that her Apache connections were assets rather than threats. Now, with Hope secured in her cradleboard and a carefully selected group of supplies in her pack, Emma began the climb toward the ridge where the gathering would take place. This time, however, she was not alone. Following at a respectful distance were Dr. Hayes, Margaret Sullivan, and Sheriff Bradley. The 3 people Emma had determined were most likely to approach the Apache settlement with genuine respect and openness. The transformation of the hidden valley took Emma's breath away. What had been a modest settlement of perhaps 50 women and children had become a bustling community of nearly 200 people. Multiple bands had converged for the gathering, bringing with them horses, goods for trade, and knowledge to share. The temporary expansion had been achieved without destroying the valley's natural beauty. Additional shelters blended seamlessly with the landscape, and the increased population seemed to flow naturally around the hot springs and stone formations. Sarah Crow Feather met Emma at the valley's entrance, her face radiant with the joy of successful reunion. Behind her stood other leaders Emma had not met before, women and men from different bands who had come specifically to meet the white woman who had become a bridge between worlds. "Emma Thompson," Sarah said formally, her voice carrying far enough for many people to hear. "Sister of the winter storms, mother of hope, friend to the mountain people. You are welcome in our gathering." The formal welcome was echoed by voices throughout the valley, creating a wall of sound that made Emma's eyes fill with tears. She had never imagined being welcomed so completely into a community that had every reason to view her with suspicion, but it was the introduction of her white companions that truly tested the boundaries of cultural exchange. Emma had carefully prepared them for this moment, explaining Apache protocols for greeting, appropriate behavior during ceremonies, and the importance of approaching everything with respect rather than curiosity. Now she watched nervously as Dr. Hayes, Margaret Sullivan, and Sheriff Bradley entered a space that represented centuries of Apache tradition and survival. Elena Deer Runner, as the eldest council member, stepped forward to greet the visitors. Her weathered face showed no expression as she studied each person carefully, clearly evaluating their intentions and character. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through decades of both conflict and cooperation. "With white settlers, you come as guests of Emma Thompson," she said in carefully measured English. "You come to learn, not to take. You come to understand, not to judge. This is sacred ground, made sacred by the prayers of our grandmothers and the hopes of our children. If you can respect this, you are welcome. If you cannot, you must leave now." Dr. Hayes stepped forward first, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "I come seeking knowledge about healing," he said simply. "I have seen the effectiveness of your medicines through Emma's teaching. I hope to learn from your wisdom while sharing what I know in return." Margaret Sullivan nodded her agreement. "I come as a mother who wants to learn better ways to feed and protect my children. Emma has shown me that your people understand things about living from the land that my people have forgotten." Sheriff Bradley's response was more complex. "I come as someone responsible for keeping peace in these mountains. I've seen too much conflict between our peoples. If there's a way to build understanding instead of suspicion, I want to be part of it." Elena's expression softened slightly. She gestured toward the council fire at the center of the valley. "Then you may sit and listen. But know that what you see here is not a show for your entertainment. It is our life, our truth, our way of maintaining balance in a world that often seems determined to destroy balance." The 3 days that followed challenged every assumption Emma's companions had held about Apache culture. They witnessed healing ceremonies that combined practical medicine with spiritual practices in ways that achieved results Dr. Hayes couldn't explain with his medical training. They saw children learning skills that would make them completely self-sufficient in any environment, yet also learning arts and music that revealed the depth of Apache cultural sophistication. Most importantly, they participated in discussions about the future conversations that revealed the Apache settlements' deep commitment to finding sustainable ways to live in harmony with both the land and their changing world. "We know the old ways are ending," explained Joshua Three Bears, a leader from one of the visiting bands. "The buffalo are gone, the trading routes are controlled by whites, The government wants to put us on reservations where we cannot live as our ancestors did. But we also know that some of the new ways offer possibilities our ancestors could not have imagined. He gestured toward Emma, who sat nursing hope while listening to the council proceedings. Emma has shown us that sharing knowledge can strengthen both peoples. Her presence here doesn't threaten our traditions, it expands them. And our knowledge doesn't threaten white settlements, it makes them more likely to survive and thrive. The gathering's most significant moment came when Rosa Windsong formally invited Dr. Hayes to participate in a healing ceremony for a young Apache man who had suffered a serious injury. The collaboration between Apache spiritual practices and the doctor's surgical skills saved the young man's life in ways that neither approach could have achieved alone. Emma watched the ceremony with tears of joy and pride. This was what she had envisioned when she first understood her role as a bridge between worlds, not the replacement of one culture with another, but the creation of new possibilities through respectful combination of different strengths. Sheriff Bradley was equally moved by what he witnessed, but for different reasons. He saw the potential for ending the cycle of fear and violence that had characterized so many interactions between whites and natives in the territory. If people could see this, he told Emma privately, see how much we actually have in common. How much we could help each other instead of fighting each other. The gathering concluded with a ceremony that formally recognized Emma's role as a bridge between peoples. She was given a new name, Woman Who Walks Between Worlds, and presented with a ceremonial staff that symbolized her responsibility to maintain balance and understanding between different communities. But the greatest gift came from Elena Deere, runner, who approached Emma with a proposal that would transform her life yet again. The council has decided, Elena announced, that this valley will become a permanent meeting place between our peoples. We will establish a formal trading post here, where Apache goods and knowledge can be exchanged for white goods and information. But such a place needs someone to manage it, someone who understands both worlds and can ensure that all exchanges are fair and respectful. Emma felt her heart racing as she understood the implications. You want me to. We want you to become the first official mediator between Apache and white communities in this territory, Elena continued. You would live here part of the time, at your cabin part of the time, traveling between communities as needed. You would help resolve conflicts, facilitate trade, and teach people from both cultures how to understand each other. The offer was overwhelming in its scope and potential. Emma looked down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, and tried to imagine raising her daughter in a world where such a role was not only possible but necessary. I would have the support of both communities? Emma asked. You would. Have whatever support you need, Sarah assured her. The Apache bands have agreed to provide security and resources for the trading post. And your white friends have agreed to help convince their communities that cooperation is more profitable than conflict. Dr. Hayes nodded enthusiastically. I've already spoken with other physicians in the territory. There's tremendous interest in learning Apache healing methods. And we have medical supplies and knowledge that could benefit your people as well. Margaret Sullivan added, the women's groups in 3 different settlements have asked me to arrange for them to learn Apache food preservation and preparation techniques. They're willing to trade goods and skills for that knowledge. Sheriff Bradley's contribution was perhaps most crucial. I've been corresponding with territorial officials about the situation here. There's growing recognition that partnerships with native peoples are more effective than forced relocations for maintaining peace and prosperity in frontier regions. Your role as mediator could become a model for other areas. As the gathering dispersed and the visiting bands began their journeys back to their home territories, Emma found herself standing at the center of a transformation that stretched far beyond her personal survival story. What had begun as a desperate attempt to keep herself and her unborn child alive had evolved into something that could change the relationship between entire cultures. Hope stirred in her arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the world. Emma looked down at her daughter and whispered, "You're going to grow up in a world where different peoples learn from each other instead of fighting each other. You're going to be part of something bigger than anyone imagined possible." The spring gathering was ending, but Emma understood that it marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the Mountain Territory, a chapter where cooperation replaced conflict, where knowledge was shared instead of hoarded, where children like Hope could grow up truly free to move between worlds without having to choose just one. The challenge arrived with the first cold snap of autumn, wrapped in official territorial papers and carried by a man whose starched collar and city boots marked him as dangerously out of place in the mountain wilderness. Commissioner Henry Whitmore had traveled from Denver with a mandate to investigate reports of irregular interactions between white settlers and native populations in the region, and his arrival at Henderson's trading post sent ripples of anxiety through the carefully constructed bridges Emma had spent months building. Emma heard about the commissioner's presence within hours of his arrival, carried by young Tommy Henderson on horseback to her cabin where she was teaching Hope to walk among the falling leaves. The boy's breathless report painted a picture of a man armed with bureaucratic authority and suspicious of any arrangement that didn't fit neatly into government categories. "Pa says he's got papers from the territorial governor," Tommy gasped, still catching his breath from the hard ride. "Says he's here to investigate unauthorized trade relationships and potential security threats. He's been asking lots of questions about you, Miss Emma, and about the Apache women who helped you." Emma felt her stomach clench with familiar fear, but this time it was different from the simple terror of physical survival she had known during the winter. This was the fear of watching something precious and important be destroyed by people who couldn't understand its value. The trading post that had been established in the Hidden Valley was thriving, bringing benefits to both Apache and white communities. Marriages were being arranged between young people from different cultures. Children were learning multiple languages, and conflicts that might once have led to violence were being resolved through negotiation and mutual understanding. Now all of that progress was threatened by a man who saw the world in terms of legal categories and official policies rather than human relationships and practical benefits. "Tell your father I'll be there tomorrow morning," Emma told Tommy, lifting Hope into her arms. "And tell him to gather the other council members. We need to present a united front." That evening, Emma made the journey to the Apache settlement to warn Sarah and the other leaders about the commissioner's investigation. The valley was quieter now than it had been during the spring gathering, but the permanent trading post had brought steady activity and prosperity. Apache crafts were being shipped to markets in Denver and Santa Fe, while white goods and information flowed back into the native communities. The arrangement was working so well that similar partnerships were being discussed in other regions. Sarah received the news with the calm intensity that Emma had learned to associate with serious Apache councils. "We knew this would come eventually," she said, her weathered hands steady as she prepared tea for the emergency meeting. "White governments don't like arrangements they cannot control, even when those arrangements benefit everyone involved." The council that assembled that night included not only the original women who had saved Emma's life, but also representatives from the various Apache bands that had committed to the trading post arrangement. The discussion was conducted in a mixture of Apache and English, with Emma serving as translator when necessary, but the conclusions were clear regardless of language. "We will not hide," declared Elena Deer Runner, her voice carrying the authority of her 8 decades. "We have done nothing wrong. We have helped our neighbors, traded fairly, and brought peace to a region that has known too much conflict. If this commissioner wants to judge us, he will have to see us as we truly are." Rosa Winsong added her perspective as someone who had seen the practical benefits of the cultural exchange. "The healing practices we have shared have saved dozens of lives in the white settlements. The agricultural techniques we learned from white farmers have improved our food security. Both peoples are stronger because of what we have built together. But it was Sarah who articulated the challenge they faced most clearly. The commissioner represents people who believe that different cultures cannot coexist, that one must dominate the other for there to be peace. We must show him that this belief is not only wrong, but dangerous. We must demonstrate that cooperation creates strength, not weakness. The strategy they developed was both simple and bold. Rather than hiding their activities or trying to minimize their significance, they would invite Commissioner Whitmore to witness the full extent of their cultural partnership. They would show him the trading post, introduce him to families that had been formed across cultural lines, and demonstrate the practical benefits that had resulted from their cooperation. Emma would serve as the primary spokesperson, drawing on her unique position as someone who truly belonged to both worlds. But she would be supported by representatives from both communities, creating a presentation that would be impossible to dismiss as the naive fantasy of one idealistic young woman. The next morning, Emma arrived at Henderson's trading post to find Commissioner Whitmore exactly as Tommy had described, a tall, thin man with pale skin and soft hands, wearing clothes that proclaimed his urban origins and his distance from the realities of frontier life. His eyes were intelligent but cold, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been forced to question his assumptions about how the world should work. "Miss Thompson," he said, rising from the table where he had been reviewing documents, "I understand you are the young woman who has been facilitating relationships between white settlers and Apache bands in this region." Emma met his gaze steadily, drawing on the strength she had learned from both Margaret and the Apache women. "I am Emma Thompson, yes. And I have been helping my neighbors, both white and Apache, find ways to support each other instead of fighting each other." The commissioner's expression suggested he found her directness surprising. "I see. And you believe these relationships are beneficial to territorial security and development?" "I know they are," Emma replied firmly. "Would you like to see the evidence?" What followed was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of everything Emma and her allies had built over the past year. Dr. Hayes presented medical records showing the dramatic improvement in health outcomes that had resulted from combining Apache and white healing practices. Margaret Sullivan displayed agricultural innovations that had increased crop yields while reducing the labor required for farming. Sheriff Bradley provided crime statistics demonstrating that the region had experienced unprecedented peace and stability since the cultural exchange began. But it was the visit to the Apache settlement that truly challenged Commissioner Whitmore's preconceptions. Emma led him through the valley, Hope riding contentedly in her cradle board, while Sarah provided commentary on the various activities they witnessed. The commissioner saw Apache children learning to read and write English while white children learned Apache languages and survival skills. He witnessed trade negotiations conducted with a sophistication that rivaled anything he had seen in Denver's business districts. He observed healing ceremonies that incorporated both spiritual practices and medical techniques in ways that achieved results neither tradition could accomplish alone. Most importantly, he met the families that had been formed across cultural lines, white men who had married Apache women, Apache men who had married white women, and children who moved effortlessly between both worlds. These families were not exotic curiosities, but successful examples of how cultural diversity could create strength rather than conflict. "How do you resolve disputes?" the commissioner asked Sarah during their tour of the settlement. "When there are conflicts between different cultural expectations or practices?" Sarah smiled and gestured toward a group of people engaged in what appeared to be a formal discussion. "We talk, we listen. We find solutions that honor both traditions while serving the practical needs of all involved. It requires patience and wisdom, but it works better than force or legal mandates." The commissioner observed the dispute resolution process with fascination. A disagreement about water rights between Apache and white farmers was being mediated by a council that included representatives from both cultures. The solution they reached, a rotating schedule that took into account both Apache spiritual practices and white agricultural needs, was more creative and sustainable than anything the court could have imposed. As the day progressed, Emma watched. The commissioner's rigid certainty began to crack. He had arrived expecting to find a dangerous situation that threatened territorial authority and white supremacy. Instead, he was witnessing a functional alternative to the conflict and displacement that characterized most white native relationships in the region. The turning point came during the evening meal, when Commissioner Whitmore was invited to share food with a mixed group that included Apache elders, white settlers, and children from both cultures. The conversation flowed naturally between languages, topics, and perspectives, creating an atmosphere of genuine community that transcended the artificial boundaries the commissioner had expected to find. "This is remarkable," he admitted to Emma, as they watched Hope playing with other children while their parents discussed plans for the coming winter. "I came here expecting to find a security threat. Instead, I'm seeing something that could serve as a model for peaceful coexistence throughout the territory." Emma felt a surge of hope, but she also understood that one impressed official was not enough to protect what they had built. "The question," she said carefully, "is whether your superiors will see it the same way." The commissioner was quiet for a long moment, watching the children play and the adults work together with the easy familiarity of people who genuinely trusted each other. "There are those in the territorial government who believe that the only good Indian is a dead Indian," he said finally. "But there are others who understand that such thinking is both morally wrong and practically disastrous. What you have accomplished here, it could change how we approach these relationships throughout the West." Over the following days, Commissioner Whitmore conducted extensive interviews with members of both communities, gathering evidence about the practical benefits of their partnership. He documented increased agricultural productivity, improved health outcomes, reduced crime rates, and enhanced regional stability. Most importantly, he recorded testimony from dozens of families about how the cultural exchange had improved their lives in ways that went far beyond mere economic benefit. When he finally prepared to leave, the commissioner had transformed from skeptical investigator to passionate advocate. "I will be recommending to the territorial governor that this arrangement be officially recognized and supported," he told Emma. "Moreover, I will be suggesting that similar partnerships be encouraged in other regions." But Emma had learned to be cautious about promises from government officials. "And if there are those who oppose such recognition?" she asked. The commissioner's expression grew serious. "Then we will have to prove that cooperation is stronger than conflict, that partnership is more profitable than domination. It won't be easy, but what you have built here gives us something concrete to point to, proof that different peoples can live together in ways that benefit everyone." As Commissioner Whitmore rode away from the settlement, Emma felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar coat. The test had been passed, but it was only the first of many challenges that would come. The bridges she had helped build between worlds were strong, but they would need constant maintenance and protection from those who preferred the simplicity of separation to the complexity of integration. Hope took her first independent steps. That evening, walking unsteadily but determinedly from Emma's arms to Sarah's waiting hands. As Emma watched her daughter navigate the space between two loving figures from different cultures, she understood that this was what she had truly been working toward. Understood that this was what she had truly been working toward. World where children could grow up free to embrace the full richness of human diversity without being forced to choose sides in conflicts they had not created. The letter arrived on a crisp October morning, carried by a postal rider who had traveled for 3 days through increasingly difficult terrain to reach the mountain settlement. Emma recognized the official territorial seal before she broke the wax, but nothing could have prepared her for the contents that would transform her personal story of survival into something with implications stretching across the entire American West. Miss Thompson, the letter began in the formal script of government correspondence. The territorial governor has reviewed Commissioner Whitmer's report regarding the cultural partnerships established in your region. Based on his recommendations and the documented benefits of your work, you are hereby invited to serve as Special Advisor on Native Relations to the territorial government. Your unique experience and demonstrated success in fostering cooperation between diverse communities makes you an invaluable resource for addressing similar challenges throughout our territories. Emma read the letter 3 times before the full meaning settled into her understanding. The government wanted her to help establish trading posts and cultural exchange programs in other regions, using the model she had helped create as a template for transforming relationships between white settlers and native peoples across the West. It was an opportunity to impact thousands of lives, to prevent the conflicts and tragedies that had marked so much of the frontier experience. But it was also a responsibility that would require her to leave the mountain valley that had become her home, to travel extensively, and to navigate political complexities that made her winter survival seem simple by comparison. Emma looked down at Hope, who was now walking confidently and beginning to speak in both English and Apache, and wondered what kind of life this new role would create for her daughter. Sarah Crow Feather found Emma sitting by the hot springs that evening, staring into the steaming water as if it might hold answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. The Apache leader had become more than a mentor over the past year. She had become the closest thing to a mother Emma had known since Margaret's death, and her counsel was invaluable in moments of difficult decision. "You are troubled by the letter," Sarah observed, settling beside Emma with the fluid grace that marked all her movements. "It offers you great honor, but also great burden." Emma nodded, grateful for Sarah's ability to understand complex emotions without lengthy explanations. "I want to help other communities avoid the conflicts we've seen in so many places. But I also want to be a good mother to Hope, to give her the stability and security she needs to grow up confident and strong." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "When I was taken by the Apache as a child," she said finally, "I thought my world was ending. I fought against my new life, longed for the world I had lost, refused to accept that I could belong in a place so different from what I had known. But my Apache grandmother told me something that changed my understanding of belonging." Emma waited, knowing that Sarah's stories always carried wisdom that went far beyond their surface meanings. She said that some people are born to live in one place, to tend one garden, to know one community deeply. These people create stability and continuity. They are the roots that hold the earth together. But other people are born to move between places, to carry seeds from one garden to another, to help different communities learn from each other. These people create growth and change. They are the wind that carries life to new places. Sarah turned to meet Emma's eyes directly. "You are wind, Emma Thompson. You always have been. The winter that brought you to us was not a random tragedy. It was the beginning of your true path. Hope will grow up understanding that her mother's work makes the world better for all children, not just for her alone." The wisdom in Sarah's words resonated deeply, but Emma still felt the weight of practical concerns. How can I raise a child while traveling constantly? How can I give hope, the sense of home and belonging that every child needs? By showing her that home is not a place, but a way of being in the world, Sarah replied. By teaching her that belonging comes from understanding her purpose and living it fully. By surrounding her with people who love her not because of where she lives, but because of who she is. Over the following weeks, Emma worked with the Apache Council and her white allies to develop a plan that would allow her to accept the territorial position while maintaining her connections to the mountain community. The settlement would serve as her base of operations, the place she returned to between assignments, the community that would help raise hope while Emma was traveling. Dr. Hayes had agreed to establish a permanent medical practice in the valley, creating a health center that would serve both Apache and white communities while training healers in the integrated approaches they had developed. Margaret Sullivan had decided to relocate her family to the settlement, where her sons could receive the kind of education that combined practical skills with cultural understanding. Most importantly, a network of families from both cultures had committed to serving as extended family for Hope, ensuring that she would never lack for care, guidance, or belonging regardless of Emma's travel schedule. The child would grow up with grandparents from multiple traditions, siblings from different backgrounds, and an understanding of the world that transcended the artificial boundaries that separated most communities. Emma's first assignment came in November, when she was asked to mediate a potentially explosive conflict between Navajo communities and white ranchers in the New Mexico territory. The situation had all the elements that typically led to violence, competition for water resources, cultural misunderstandings, and government policies that favored white interests over native rights. Emma traveled to the region with Hope, accompanied by Rosa Winsong and Sheriff Bradley, who had requested leave from his duties to help establish the mediation process. The journey took them through landscapes that shifted from familiar mountain terrain to vast deserts that stretched beyond the horizon, reminding Emma that the world was far larger and more diverse than she had ever imagined. The conflicts in New Mexico were more complex than anything Emma had encountered in her mountain valley. The Navajo communities had been dealing with encroachment on their traditional lands for decades, while the white ranchers were struggling to establish sustainable operations in an environment they didn't fully understand. Government policies designed to resolve these conflicts had instead made them worse, creating a web of legal and practical problems that seemed impossible to untangle. Emma had learned that seemingly impossible situations often contained the seeds of their own solutions. Working with local leaders from both communities, she began to identify areas where cooperation could benefit everyone involved. The Navajo possessed deep knowledge about desert survival and water management that could help white ranchers succeed in the harsh environment. The ranchers had access to markets and resources that could benefit Navajo communities struggling with economic pressures. Most importantly, both groups shared common concerns about the sustainability of their way of life in a region where water was scarce and climate patterns were unpredictable. These shared concerns became the foundation for discussions that gradually moved from positions of antagonism to possibilities for partnership. The breakthrough came when Emma arranged for a joint expedition to locate new water sources, combining Navajo knowledge of the land with white drilling techniques and equipment. The success of this collaboration led to a formal agreement that established shared water rights, created economic partnerships between ranchers and Navajo communities, and set up a council system for resolving future disputes. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the establishment of a cultural exchange program that allowed Navajo children to learn ranching skills, while white children learned desert survival techniques. This program, modeled on the educational approaches Emma had observed in her mountain settlement, created connections between young people that would influence relationships for generations to come. Emma documented the New Mexico success carefully, creating a detailed report that would serve as a guide for similar efforts in other regions. She included not only the practical steps that had led to resolution, but also the cultural sensitivities, communication strategies, and relationship-building techniques that had made cooperation possible. The report impressed territorial officials enough that Emma was quickly assigned to additional conflicts in Arizona, Utah, and California. Each situation presented unique challenges, but the underlying principles remained consistent. Listen to all parties, identify shared interests, create opportunities for mutual benefit, and build relationships that could withstand future pressures. As Emma's reputation grew, she began receiving requests for assistance from communities across the West. The Thompson method of conflict resolution was being discussed in government circles, academic institutions, and newspaper editorials. What had begun as one young woman's desperate attempt to survive a harsh winter had evolved into a new approach to some of the most intractable problems facing the expanding American nation. But Emma never forgot that her true strength came not from her individual capabilities, but from the community that had saved her life and continued to support her work. The mountain settlement remained her anchor, the place where she recharged her spirit and renewed her commitment to the vision of cooperation that had emerged from her darkest winter. Hope was thriving in this environment, growing up trilingual and comfortable with the cultural diversity that would define her generation's experience of the American West. At 2 years old, she could identify medicinal plants, understand basic Apache ceremonies, and charmed white officials with her precocious intelligence and multicultural perspective. Emma often watched her daughter playing with other children from the settlement and marveled at how naturally they moved between different cultural contexts. These children were pioneering a new kind of American identity, one that honored diverse traditions while creating something entirely original. The work was challenging, sometimes dangerous, and always demanding. But Emma had learned that the most important struggles were often the most difficult ones, and that the bridges between worlds required constant maintenance and protection. Each successful mediation, each new partnership, each child who grew up seeing diversity as strength rather than threat, represented another step toward the kind of world Margaret had dreamed of when she taught Emma that survival was about staying human while staying alive. As winter approached again, Emma prepared for her next assignment while also preparing for the anniversary of the night that had changed everything. Soon it would be 2 years since she had first tasted pine bark and wondered if she would live to see spring. Now she was helping to reshape the American West, one relationship at a time, one community at a time, one child at a time. The circle was widening, and Emma stood at its center, no longer the frightened girl who had eaten bark to survive, but the woman who had learned to transform survival into service, isolation into connection, and desperation into hope that could change the world. 5 years had passed since Emma Thompson first tasted pine bark to survive a winter that should have killed her. Now, as she stood before the first Western Conference on Intercultural Relations in San Francisco, she looked out at an audience that would have been impossible to imagine during those desperate months, when staying alive required eating the forest itself. Tribal leaders sat beside territorial governors, Apache healers shared tables with university professors, and white settlers listened respectfully to Navajo elders, discussing sustainable agriculture techniques. Emma held Hope's hand as they approached the podium, her 5-year-old daughter moving with the confident poise of a child who had never known a world where different cultures couldn't coexist peacefully. Hope had grown into a living symbol of the new America Emma had helped create, fluent in 3 languages, equally comfortable in Apache ceremonies and white social gatherings, carrying herself with the quiet strength that came from understanding. She belonged everywhere because she had learned to make herself at home anywhere. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had transformed personal survival into social revolution. 5 years ago, I was a frightened 16-year-old girl facing the worst winter in territorial history, with nothing but a dwindling supply of cornmeal and the desperate hope that I might live long enough to bring my child safely into the world. Today, I stand before you as proof that the greatest challenges often contain the seeds of the greatest opportunities. The audience was silent, recognizing that they were about to hear the definitive version of a story that had already become legend throughout the American West. Emma had told variations of this tale, hundreds of times in her work as a mediator. But this telling would be different. This would be the story of how individual survival had become collective transformation. I survived that winter because 200 Apache women refused to let me die alone, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. They didn't save me because I deserved it, or because I had earned it, or because they expected anything in return. They saved me because they understood something that our cultures had forgotten, that the strength to survive comes not from individual determination, but from the networks of care and support that connect us to each other. Emma spoke about the fun gifts that had appeared in the snow, the quiet presence that had watched over her during her darkest months, the hands that had guided her through childbirth, and the voices that had sung her daughter into the world. She described the gradual recognition that survival was not an individual achievement, but a community effort, and that the communities that survived were the ones that learned to include rather than exclude, to share rather than hoard, to cooperate rather than compete. But this story is not really about me, Emma said, lifting hope so that the child could see the full audience. It's about her, and about all the children who will grow up in the world we choose to create. Hope has never known a world where Apache and white children couldn't play together, where different healing traditions couldn't be combined, where cultural diversity was seen as a threat rather than a strength. She represents the future we can build when we choose cooperation over conflict. The audience responded with applause that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere appreciation. It was the sound of recognition, of people seeing possibilities they had not known existed. Emma had learned over the years that the most powerful stories were not those that told people what to think, but those that helped them remember what they already knew in their hearts. Emma's presentation was followed by a series of reports from communities across the West that had implemented variations of the Thompson method of intercultural cooperation. Dr. Hayes, now the director of the Western Institute for Integrated Medicine, presented data showing that communities with cultural exchange programs had 60% lower rates of violent conflict and 40% better health outcomes than those without such programs. Sheriff Bradley, who had become a regional coordinator for intercultural law enforcement, reported that crime rates had dropped dramatically in areas where Apache and white communities worked together on Encore, that crime rates had dropped dramatically in areas where Apache and white communities worked together on security issues. But it was the testimony from the children themselves that truly captured the audience's attention. A group of young people from different cultural backgrounds took the stage to demonstrate the skills they had learned through intercultural education programs. They showed how Apache tracking techniques could be combined with white surveying methods to create more accurate maps, how native plant knowledge could be integrated with European agricultural practices to increase crop yields, and how traditional healing ceremonies could be enhanced with modern medical techniques to achieve better patient outcomes. Most importantly, they demonstrated something that had been lost in most American communities: the ability to disagree respectfully, to find common ground across cultural differences, and to solve problems through collaboration rather than domination. These young people had grown up seeing diversity as an asset rather than a liability, and their confidence in working across cultural boundaries offered a glimpse of what American society could become if it chose cooperation over conquest. The conference concluded with the signing of the Western Compact on Intercultural Relations, a formal agreement between territorial governments and native tribes that established legal frameworks for the kind of cooperation Emma had pioneered. The compact recognized tribal sovereignty while creating mechanisms for shared governance of resources, established educational exchange programs, and created a network of cultural centers that would serve as meeting places for ongoing collaboration. Emma was named the first director of the Western Bureau of Intercultural Relations, a position that would allow her to coordinate cooperation efforts Across the entire American West, it was a recognition of how far she had traveled from the desperate girl who had eaten bark to survive. But it was also a reminder that the work of building bridges between worlds was never finished. It required constant attention, continuous care, and the willingness to keep learning from each other. As the conference attendees began to disperse, Emma found herself surrounded by people who wanted to share their own stories of transformation. A white rancher from Texas described how Apache water management techniques had saved his cattle operation during a severe drought. A Navajo woman from Arizona told how access to white medical supplies had helped her community survive a cholera outbreak. A Mexican trader from California explained how intercultural partnerships had created new markets that benefited everyone involved. But the conversation that moved Emma most deeply came from Sarah Crowfeather, who had traveled from the mountain settlement to witness Emma's moment of national recognition. The Apache leader, now in her 50s but still carrying herself with the grace and authority that had first impressed Emma, pulled her aside as the evening celebration began. "Do you remember," Sarah asked, "what I told you about people who are born to be wind, who carry seeds from one garden to another?" Emma nodded, remembering the conversation by the hot springs that had helped her understand her true calling. "I have been thinking about that metaphor," Sarah continued, "and I realize it was incomplete. You are not just wind, you are also soil. You don't just carry seeds between gardens, you help them take root and grow. The communities you have touched don't just adopt your methods, they become part of your extended family." Emma felt tears spring to her eyes as she understood the deeper meaning of Sarah's words. The network of relationships she had built over the years had become something more than professional connections or political alliances. They had become a new kind of kinship system that transcended the traditional boundaries of race, culture, and geography. "Hope will grow up with sisters and brothers in dozens of communities," Sarah continued. "She will have grandparents from multiple traditions, teachers from different cultures, and a sense of belonging that spans the entire continent. This is the true legacy of what you have built, not just peace between peoples, but family relationships that make such peace natural and sustainable." That night, Emma tucked Hope into bed in their San Francisco hotel room, listening to her daughter's sleepy questions about the day's events. Hope had been fascinated by the diversity of the conference attendees, the different languages she had heard, the various cultural demonstrations she had witnessed. "Mama," Hope asked, "why do some people think it's strange that we know so many different kinds of people?" Emma considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would shape how Hope understood her place in the world. "Some people are afraid of differences because they think differences mean conflict," she said finally. "But we know that differences can mean strength if we learn to appreciate them instead of fear them. Like how Apache medicines and white medicines work better together than apart?" Hope asked. "Exactly like that," Emma replied, marveling at how naturally her daughter grasped concepts that many adults struggled to understand. When different kinds of knowledge come together, they create possibilities that neither could achieve alone. Hope was quiet for a moment, processing this idea. Then she asked, "Will there always be people who are afraid of differences?" Emma felt the weight of the question, knowing that she was being asked to predict the future of human relations based on her experience of building bridges between worlds. "Probably," she said honestly. "But there will also always be people like you, who grow up seeing differences as opportunities rather than threats. And as long as there are people like you, the world will keep getting better at living together." As Hope drifted off to sleep, Emma stood by the window looking out at the lights of San Francisco, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The winter that had nearly killed her had become the foundation for a life of service that had touched thousands of people across the American West. The desperation that had driven her to eat bark had transformed into determination to ensure that no one would have to face such challenges alone. Apache women who had saved her life had given her more than physical survival. They had given her a model for how human communities could function when they chose cooperation over competition, inclusion over exclusion, generosity over greed. The sisterhood that had welcomed her during her darkest hours had expanded into a network of relationships that was reshaping the entire American frontier. Emma thought about Margaret, buried beneath the apple tree beside the cabin where this story had begun. Her stepmother had taught her that survival was about staying human while staying alive. But Emma had learned that staying human required staying connected to the larger community of humanity. The individualism that characterized so much of American culture was not strength. It was a form of weakness that made everyone more vulnerable to the challenges that life inevitably presented. The moon was rising over the Pacific Ocean, its light creating a silver path across the water that seemed to point toward infinite possibilities. Emma placed her hand on her heart and felt the steady rhythm that had carried her through winter storms and summer conflicts, through moments of despair and occasions of triumph, through the daily work of building bridges between worlds that had seemed permanently separated. Somewhere in the mountain settlement, the hot springs were still warming the valley where hope had been born, where children were still learning to move between cultures with the confidence that came from understanding that belonging was not about choosing sides, but about choosing to see the humanity in everyone. The trading post was still operating. The cultural exchange programs were still bringing people together, and the next generation of bridge builders was still growing up with the skills and perspectives that would be needed to keep expanding. The circle of human cooperation. Emma Thompson had eaten bark to survive one winter, but she had spent the rest of her life helping others learn to feast on the abundance that became possible when different peoples chose to share their gifts rather than guard them jealously. The legacy of that choice would outlive any individual, creating ripples that would spread across generations and continents, transforming not just the American West, but the entire human understanding of what it meant to survive and thrive together. Sisterhood that had saved her life had become a brotherhood and sisterhood that could save the world, one relationship at a time, one community at a time, one child at a time. And that, Emma knew, was how real change always happened, not through grand gestures or political proclamations, but through the patient work of people who chose to see each other as family rather than strangers, as resources rather than threats, as partners in the great adventure of building a world where everyone could belong. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.